"No god has ever asked for blood," Daniel Hayes would say later, but at that moment, standing at the edge of the black stone valley with the cold desert air cutting through his jacket, he wasn't thinking about gods at all, only about the girl kneeling beneath a ring of ancient light as the first hint of dawn brushed the horizon in pale silver. The wind moved in low, steady currents across the basalt cliffs, carrying the hum of alien voices rising in measured harmony, a chant that vibrated through the ground and into the reinforced soles of his boots, and below him, nearly 200 yards away, Lysra Thane knelt inside a circular structure of towering crystalline pylons, each one etched with symbols that glowed faintly blue, their light reflecting off her iridescent skin so she seemed less like a prisoner and more like part of the machine itself. Daniel adjusted the lens on his field scanner, numbers scrolling across his wrist display in tight green columns, atmospheric charge building. Magnetic pressure unstable, residual energy signatures older than any mining rig he had ever worked on, and he swallowed as the realization settled in that this wasn't a temple, it was a regulator, a planetary climate system left behind by a civilization long gone. The alien elders stood in a wide arc around Lysra, their robes catching the breeze, their faces solemn but not cruel, and that disturbed him more than anger would have, because this wasn't rage or punishment, it was tradition, heavy and unquestioned. Lysra's hands rested calmly on her knees, unbound, her posture straight, her expression steady, and when the wind shifted she turned her head slightly toward the ridge where Daniel lay concealed behind a fractured slab of rock, and for a second, just 1 second, her luminous eyes aligned with his position as if she could feel him there, the faint glow beneath her skin pulsing once, soft as a heartbeat. Daniel exhaled slowly and checked the charge indicator again, 68% and climbing, the ring above her head humming louder now, harmonics layering over the chant, and he muttered under his breath that he'd only come out here to survey mineral rights for a private contract, not to interfere in a ritual that had probably been performed for centuries. The sun's rim edged above the horizon, casting long gold bands across the valley floor, catching in Lysra's hairwear. Strands of bioluminescent filament shimmered like fiber optics, and the elders raised their hands toward the central ring, which responded with a low-frequency vibration that rattled Daniel's teeth even from this distance. His scanner flashed a warning, energy draw imminent, and a new line of data resolved on the display, biological conduit required. Daniel frowned, zoomed in, recalibrated, and felt his stomach tighten as he understood what the system had been built to do, not consume, not destroy, but interface, drawing a living electrical signature to complete a circuit. Below, Lysra closed her eyes, not in fear but in acceptance, and the crowd's chant softened to a whisper that carried across the valley like wind through dry grass. Daniel's thumb hovered over the activation switch on his comm unit, the rational part of his mind listing reasons to stay hidden, foreign customs, non-interference, survival odds. But another memory surfaced instead, hospital lights reflected in stainless steel, a flatline tone that had once stolen everything from him, and he felt that same cold helplessness creeping in now. The ring's glow intensified, bathing Lysra in a rising halo of pale blue, and the first crackle of static leapt between the pylons, thin arcs dancing like silent lightning. Daniel pushed himself up from the rock, heart pounding hard enough to drown out the chant, and whispered to no one in particular, "That's not how this is supposed to work," as the sun cleared the horizon. And the machine prepared to awaken. Daniel did not remember deciding to move, only that one moment he was on the ridge with the wind clawing at his jacket and the next he was sliding down loose shale toward the valley floor, boots scraping against black stone, heart pounding in uneven bursts as the hum from the crystalline ring deepened into something that felt almost alive. The elders noticed him when he was about 100 feet out, their chant faltering, several turning in unison with expressions that were not angry but startled, as though a rule of nature had just been quietly rearranged. Daniel raised both hands to show he carried no weapon, only the compact field scanner clipped at his belt, and he forced his voice to stay steady even as the air thickened with static that lifted the hair along his arms. "Stop," he called out, his words carried thin by the wind, "it is not asking for her life." A ripple moved through the gathered crowd, low murmurs layered over the rising frequency of the ring, and Lysra opened her eyes, the blue glow beneath her skin intensifying in response to the machine above her. From this distance Daniel could see faint geometric patterns flickering across the inner surface of the pylons, data sequences responding to proximity, to bioelectric signatures, to something far more precise than superstition. one of the elders stepped forward, tall and silver-eyed. His voice calm but edged with warning as he spoke in the trade language Daniel had learned during months of contract negotiations. Human, you stand within sacred ground. The dawn requires balance. Daniel shook his head and tapped his scanner, projecting a small holographic graph into the air between them, lines climbing in clean mathematical arcs. This structure is regulating your atmosphere, he said, each word deliberate. It is stabilizing pressure fronts before the storm season. It needs a neural interface, not a sacrifice. The word sacrifice felt wrong even as he said it, because there were no restraints on Lysera's wrists, no fear in her posture, only acceptance that cut deeper than panic would have. She rose slowly to her feet inside the circle, the early sunlight tracing a soft outline along her shoulders, and when she looked at Daniel there was no accusation in her gaze, only a quiet question. If this fails, she said, her voice clear, resonant, carrying across the valley without effort, my people lose their protection. Daniel took another step closer, now within 30 feet of the ring, the air around him buzzing lightly against his skin like the edge of a live wire. It will fail if you give it what it does not need, he answered, glancing at the charge indicator climbing past 75%. This system was built to connect to someone like you, not end you. The elders exchanged uncertain looks, tradition pressing against new information. Like opposing tides, and the wind shifted again, stronger now, sweeping sand in thin spirals across the valley floor. Above them the ring flared brighter, arcs of contained energy weaving in careful patterns that were too structured to be random, too measured to be wrath. Daniel felt the old weight of hesitation try to settle into his chest, the familiar instinct to step back and let another culture decide its own fate. But Lysera's luminous skin flickered once more, and he saw not a symbol or a ritual offering, but a person standing alone beneath a machine no one fully understood. He drew in a slow breath of cold desert air and lowered his hands, not in surrender but in resolve, as the first true pulse of power rolled outward from the ring and the valley waited to see which belief would hold. The pulse did not explode outward the way fear expected. It expanded in a measured wave that rolled across the valley like a low tide of light, brushing against Daniel's chest and passing through him with a sensation that felt more like pressure than heat, and for a moment every sound dropped away except the steady harmonic hum of the ring. The elders instinctively stepped back, not in panic but in uncertainty, their long robes stirring as wind currents shifted direction, drawn toward the center where Lysera now stood with her arms slightly out from her sides, her skin glowing brighter with each incremental rise in frequency. Daniel glanced at his scanner and saw the energy curve spike past 80%, then fluctuate as if searching for a stable pattern, and he realized the system was not complete without intentional contact. It is waiting for you to connect, he said, his voice firm but not loud, eyes fixed on Lysera rather than the elders, because this was no longer about convincing tradition, it was about trust. She studied him in silence, the blue luminescence beneath her skin rippling in soft waves, and he could see the conflict in the subtle tightening of her jaw, the weight of generations pressing against a single unfamiliar possibility. The air around the pylons crackled gently, threads of contained energy weaving between crystalline edges like living circuitry, structured and precise. Daniel took one cautious step closer, now less than 15 feet from the threshold of the ring, and extended his scanner toward the nearest pylon, projecting the data overlay again so that geometric lines hovered in the space between them. This device responds to neural frequency and bioelectric coherence, he explained steadily, choosing words that would not sound like accusation. It is not asking for loss. It is asking for synchronization. Lysera lowered her gaze briefly to the glowing symbols at her feet, then lifted it again to meet his, and in that look Daniel saw something shift. Not fear dissolving but responsibility transforming. She moved toward the center of the ring and placed one hand against the air just below the suspended halo, and the machine answered instantly, light cascading down in structured bands that traced the contours of her arm without harm, mapping, reading, calibrating. A soft collective intake of breath moved through the gathered crowd as the hum stabilized into a clearer tone, less erratic, more focused. Daniel watched the scanner's graph smooth into a controlled arc, the charge redistributing rather than escalating, and he allowed himself a slow exhale he had not realized he was holding. Then the system surged again, a sudden imbalance, the energy draw climbing too rapidly as if the connection was incomplete. Lysera's glow intensified, bright enough now to cast pale reflections across the stone floor, And Daniel understood with a tightening in his chest that the machine required a secondary grounding source. Without hesitating he stepped fully into the circle, the air around him buzzing sharply against his skin, and positioned himself opposite her beneath the ring. The elders murmured in alarm but did not interfere, tradition suspended by unfolding reality. Daniel removed his glove and pressed his palm against the outer frame of the nearest pylon, feeling a low vibration travel up his arm. Steady and strong. You are not alone in this, he said quietly, not as command but as promise, and when Lysra met his eyes again, the light between them shifted from wild intensity to something balanced, the hum settling into a deep, resonant tone that felt less like judgment and more like awakening. The vibration beneath Daniel's palm deepened into a steady current, not painful but powerful, like gripping the frame of a running generator, and he felt the energy travel through the crystalline lattice into the ground below, dispersing in controlled waves instead of chaotic spikes. Across from him Lysra stood tall within the ring, her luminous skin no longer flaring unpredictably but glowing in rhythmic pulses that matched the tone of the machine, each pulse softer than the last, as though two separate heartbeats were learning to synchronize. The air smelled faintly metallic, charged with ozone, and thin threads of light arced overhead in graceful loops that no longer snapped or flickered. Daniel kept his breathing slow and even, focusing on the numbers scrolling across his scanner display clipped at his belt. Watching as the atmospheric pressure index stabilized point by point, the red warning icons fading to amber, then to green. Beyond the circle the elders stood motionless, their earlier certainty replaced by something quieter, an unfolding realization that what they had called a demand might actually be a misunderstanding. Wind that had been spiraling erratically through the valley began to smooth into long, steady currents, sweeping sand in gentle patterns rather than sharp gusts, and the heavy clouds gathering at the horizon thinned slightly, their edges breaking apart under the shifting pressure field. Lysra's gaze never left Daniel's, and in that sustained eye contact there was no accusation, only concentration, a shared awareness that one misstep could throw the balance off again. The ring above them emitted a resonant hum that vibrated through bone and stone alike, but its tone was no longer rising in pitch, it was settling. Finding equilibrium, Daniel adjusted his stance, boots firm against the black rock, and pressed his hand more securely against the pylon frame, offering his own bioelectric signature as grounding, remembering the old training from energy grid maintenance back on Earth where stabilization often required dual inputs to prevent overload. A faint shimmer formed between him and Lysra, not visible as a beam but perceptible as a change in density. The air between them feeling warmer, steadier, her fingers lifted slightly, responding instinctively to the field, and the geometric patterns etched into the pylons brightened in clean symmetrical lines instead of chaotic flashes. On his display the charge level plateaued at 92% and held, no longer climbing toward instability. A soft murmur passed through the gathered crowd as the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the valley floor, illuminating faces that were no longer braced for loss but witnessing transformation. Daniel felt a tremor run through his arm as the final surge redistributed into the ground, not draining Lysra but aligning with her, and the hum shifted into a deep, sustained tone that sounded less like machinery and more like a distant choir. He allowed himself a small nod, not in triumph but in relief, and spoke quietly across the circle, "Stay with it," his voice steady and grounded. Lysra inhaled slowly, her glow softening into a calm radiance, and for the first time since dawn the system above them did not strain or flare but simply operated, balanced and alive. As the valley exhaled and the storm line on the horizon began to dissolve into open sky, the tone of the machine did not fade. When the surge settled, it transformed into something steady and enduring, a low harmonic resonance that vibrated through the stone and into Daniel's bones like the sound of distant thunder rolling across open plains. His palm remained pressed against the crystalline frame, but the strain he had braced for never came, only a measured flow of energy that passed through him and into the ground beneath his boots, dispersing with controlled precision. Across the circle Lysra's glow softened from brilliant blue to a calmer silver hue, the light beneath her skin pulsing in smooth intervals that matched the stabilized rhythm above. The wind that had once twisted unpredictably through the valley now moved in long, even currents, carrying away the metallic scent of ozone and replacing it with the dry, mineral fragrance of sunlit stone. Daniel glanced down at his scanner and saw the atmospheric pressure index holding firm, storm vectors flattening into harmless gradients, and for the first time since he had stepped into the valley his shoulders eased. the elders remained at the perimeter, their silence deeper now, not heavy with ritual expectation but with reconsideration. One by one, several lowered their raised hands, the gesture subtle yet profound. As if acknowledging that what stood before them was not defiance but correction, Lysra slowly lowered her own hands from the glowing field, though the machine did not falter when she did. It continued to hum with quiet stability, its geometric patterns glowing in symmetrical lines that no longer flickered with imbalance. Daniel carefully removed his palm from the pylon, expecting a spike or tremor, but the system held steady, self-sustaining, no longer dependent on constant grounding. He stepped back 2 measured paces, boots scraping lightly against the basalt floor, and met Lysra's gaze once more. Up close he could see the faint exhaustion behind her luminous eyes, not from injury but from the weight of what she had been willing to accept only minutes before. Sunlight now filled the valley completely, warming the dark stone and casting long golden reflections along the edges of the crystalline pylons, transforming what had once appeared ominous into something almost serene. A quiet murmur moved through the gathered crowd, not confusion but realization, and the tall elder who had first addressed Daniel stepped forward again, his voice measured and contemplative. "The dawn has come," he said, observing the clear horizon where storm clouds had begun to dissolve into pale blue sky. Daniel nodded once, still watching the data stream scroll across his display to ensure no hidden instability remained. It was never asking for loss, he replied evenly, not challenging, not triumphant, simply stating what the evidence showed. Lysra took a slow breath, the glow beneath her skin settling into a gentle radiance that seemed less like a burden and more like a gift, and as she stepped out from the center of the ring the machine did not dim or protest. It continued its steady operation as though acknowledging her not as an offering but as a partner. Daniel felt the tension he had carried since the ridge finally loosened, replaced by something quieter and far more powerful, the understanding that sometimes the difference between fear and survival was not strength, but clarity. The tone of the machine did not fade when the surge settled, it transformed into something steady and enduring, a low harmonic resonance that vibrated through the stone and into Daniel's bones like the sound of distant thunder rolling across open plains. His palm remained pressed against the crystalline frame, but the strain he had braced for never came, only a measured flow of energy that passed through him and into the ground beneath his boots, dispersing with controlled precision. Across the circle Lysra's glow softened from brilliant blue to a calmer silver hue, the light beneath her skin pulsing in smooth intervals that matched the stabilized rhythm above. The wind that had once twisted unpredictably through the valley now moved in long, even currents, carrying away the metallic scent of ozone and replacing it with the dry, mineral fragrance of sunlit stone. Daniel glanced down at his scanner and saw the atmospheric pressure index holding firm, storm vectors flattening into harmless gradients, and for the first time since he had stepped into the valley his shoulders eased. The elders remained at the perimeter, their silence deeper now, not heavy with ritual expectation but with reconsideration. One by one, several lowered their raised hands, the gesture subtle yet profound, as if acknowledging that what stood before them was not defiance but correction. Lysra slowly lowered her own hands from the glowing field, though the machine did not falter when she did. It continued to hum with quiet stability, its geometric patterns glowing in symmetrical lines that no longer flickered with imbalance. Daniel carefully removed his palm from the pylon, expecting a spike or tremor, but the system held steady, self-sustaining, no longer dependent on constant grounding. He stepped back 2 measured paces, boots scraping lightly against the basalt floor, and met Lysra's gaze once more. Up close he could see the faint exhaustion behind her luminous eyes, not from injury but from the weight of what she had been willing to accept only minutes before. Sunlight now filled the valley completely, warming the dark stone and casting long golden reflections along the edges of the crystalline pylons, transforming what had once appeared ominous into something almost serene. A quiet murmur moved through the gathered crowd, not confusion but realization, and the tall elder who had first addressed Daniel stepped forward again, his voice measured and contemplative. "The dawn has come," he said, observing the clear horizon where storm clouds had begun to dissolve into pale blue sky. Daniel nodded once, still watching the data stream scroll across his display to ensure no hidden instability remained. It was never asking for loss, he replied evenly, not challenging, not triumphant, simply stating what the evidence showed. Lysra took a slow breath, the glow beneath her skin settling into a gentle radiance that seemed less like a burden and more like a gift, and as she stepped out from the center of the ring the machine did not dim or protest, it continued its steady operation as though acknowledging her not as an offering but as a partner. Daniel felt the tension he had carried since the ridge finally loosened, replaced by something quieter and far more powerful, the understanding that sometimes the difference between fear and survival was not strength, but clarity. The morning light grew warmer by the minute, spilling across the valley in long bands of gold that softened the harsh edges of black stone, and Daniel felt the tension in his chest ease for the first time since he had stepped down from the ridge. The machine continued its steady harmonic tone overhead, no longer dominant, simply present, like a distant engine keeping the world balanced without demanding attention. Lysra stood beside him now rather than across from him, close enough that he could see faint constellations of light beneath her silver-blue skin, subtle patterns that pulsed gently with her breathing. The elders gathered several yards away in quiet discussion, their earlier certainty replaced with careful thought, tradition bending but not breaking all at once. Daniel checked his scanner again out of habit, confirming atmospheric pressure remained stable across a 5-mile radius, storm formation probabilities dropping to negligible levels, and he allowed himself a slow exhale. It will hold, he said, mostly to himself, though Lysra heard. She turned slightly toward him, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. For cycles uncounted, we believed survival required loss, she said, her voice calm and resonant in the open air. We were taught that fear kept us safe. Daniel glanced toward the crystalline ring, watching the precise geometry of its glowing lines rotate in balanced symmetry. Fear keeps you cautious, he replied evenly. Understanding keeps you alive. A faint breeze moved between them, carrying warmth instead of the metallic charge that had filled the valley earlier, and the sound of shifting robes approached as the tall elder stepped forward once more. This time his posture was not rigid but reflective, his silver eyes studying Daniel with something close to humility. Human Daniel Hayes, he said carefully, pronouncing the name with deliberate clarity, you entered our sacred ground and altered the path of dawn. Why? Daniel considered the question for a long moment, eyes tracing the horizon where open blue sky now stretched uninterrupted, remembering the ridge, the rising charge, the look in Lysra's eyes when she had accepted her role without resistance. Because it did not have to cost her, he answered simply. There was no grand speech in his tone, no defiance, only plain truth. The elder absorbed this, then inclined his head in a gesture deeper than before, and around them the gathered crowd followed in subtle unison, not kneeling, not surrendering, but acknowledging a shift in belief. Lysra watched her people carefully, the glow along her arms reflecting sunlight in soft gradients, and Daniel sensed that something larger than a machine had stabilized this morning. It was not just the atmosphere that had been recalibrated, but the meaning attached to it. He slipped the scanner back into its holster and looked at Lysra, noting the steadiness in her posture, the absence of resignation that had defined her stance at dawn. She met his gaze and held it, and in that silent exchange there was gratitude, yes, but also partnership. The valley no longer felt like a place waiting for sacrifice, it felt like a place waiting for growth, and as the harmonic tone of the ring blended seamlessly into the sound of wind moving across stone, Daniel understood that sometimes the bravest act was not fighting a storm, but refusing to believe it demanded a victim. The valley did not return to what it had been, because something invisible had shifted beneath the stone and within the people who stood upon it, and Daniel could feel that change as clearly as the steady hum of the ring overhead. The elders had formed a wider circle now, not enclosing Lysra but standing beside her, their robes brushing softly against the basalt as they faced the machine with new eyes. Sunlight climbed higher, warming the dark ground until the air shimmered faintly in rising currents, and the crystalline pylons reflected that light in controlled prisms rather than erratic flashes. Daniel walked a slow arc around the outer perimeter, scanner in hand, verifying stability across the valley floor, watching pressure readings hold firm at safe levels across a 10-mile radius, and for the first time the data required no intervention. When he returned to Lysra's side, she was speaking quietly with the tall elder, her tone steady and assured, the faint silver radiance beneath her skin no longer a burden but a signature. He caught only fragments of their exchange, words about cycles, about knowledge preserved in fragments and misinterpreted over generations, about symbols mistaken for commands. The elder listened without interruption, his earlier authority reshaping into something more thoughtful, and when Lysra finished he turned toward the gathered crowd and raised one open hand. There was no chant this time, no ritual posture, only attentive silence. Daniel watched as the elder spoke in their native language, his voice carrying across the valley in calm, measured cadence, and though Daniel could not understand every word, he recognized the shift in tone from obligation to understanding. Lysra then stepped forward, positioning herself beneath the ring once more, not as an offering but as a living demonstration. She lifted one hand toward the glowing halo and the machine responded with a gentle increase in harmonic resonance, not straining, not demanding, simply acknowledging. The crowd inhaled softly as they witnessed what had always been possible, the system operating through partnership rather than loss. Daniel felt a subtle tightening in his throat, an emotion he rarely allowed space for, as he realized this was the true turning point, not the stabilization of the storm, but the rewriting of meaning. When Lysra lowered her hand again, the ring maintained its steady glow, self-sustaining and balanced, and the elder stepped beside her rather than in front. He placed his palm against one of the pylons, tentative at first, and the system responded with a mild fluctuation that quickly corrected itself, as though learning. A quiet ripple of realization moved through the gathered people. Daniel met Lysra's eyes and saw in them not relief alone but something stronger, a quiet determination to ensure that the next dawn would not carry the weight of fear. The wind passed through the valley in long, gentle currents, carrying warmth instead of threat, and the harmonic tone overhead blended seamlessly with the natural rhythm of the land. Daniel understood then that the greatest revelation was not that the machine could be stabilized, but that belief itself could be recalibrated, and as the valley stood beneath a clear and open sky, he sensed that what had awakened this morning was not a god, but courage. By late morning the valley no longer felt like the edge of something breaking, it felt like the beginning of something steady, and Daniel stood at the base of the crystalline ring with the sun warm against the back of his neck, listening to the low harmonic tone that now blended seamlessly with the wind. The pylons cast long, clean shadows across the basalt floor, their etched symbols glowing in calm symmetry, no longer flaring with imbalance but rotating in precise, patient patterns that suggested endurance rather than urgency. The elders had dispersed into smaller groups, speaking quietly among themselves, not to preserve the old ritual but to reinterpret it, and Lysra moved between them with measured confidence, her silver-blue radiance subtle beneath the daylight, present but no longer burdened by expectation. Daniel watched as she demonstrated once more how a simple touch against the pylon initiated a gentle response from the system, how intention and alignment mattered more than surrender, and each time the machine answered with stable resonance instead of escalating demand. He checked his scanner one final time, confirming atmospheric equilibrium across a 15-mile radius, storm probability reduced to background fluctuations, and then powered the device down, the small screen fading to black with a soft click. When he slipped it into his jacket pocket, the act felt symbolic, as though he were closing a chapter rather than concluding a contract. Lysra approached him as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of warm stone and distant mineral flats, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was no ceremony left to perform, no dramatic declaration required. "You will leave," she said gently, not as a question but as understanding. Daniel nodded once, eyes drifting to the ridge where his rover was parked beyond the valley's curve. "This place does not need me anymore," he replied, and he meant it without regret. She studied him with that steady luminous gaze that had once held resignation and now held resolve. "It needed someone to question fear," she said quietly. Daniel considered that, then offered a small, tired smile. "It needed someone brave enough to stand," he answered. The harmonic tone overhead deepened slightly as if in quiet agreement, and the sky above stretched clear and unbroken from horizon to horizon, blue unmarred by storm. Around them the people of the valley moved with cautious optimism, hands touching stone not in farewell but in familiarity. Learning a new way to greet the dawn, Daniel turned toward the path that would lead him back to his rover, boots crunching lightly against gravel, and paused once more to look over his shoulder. Lysra stood beneath the ring, sunlight tracing silver along her skin, no longer a figure awaiting loss but a guardian of understanding. He lifted one hand in a simple gesture, not of victory but of respect, and she returned it with equal steadiness. As he began to climb back toward the ridge, the valley's hum settled into the background of the world, constant and balanced, and Daniel understood that he had not defeated a god or shattered a tradition. He had only refused to accept that survival required sacrifice, and sometimes that refusal was enough to change a sky.